Hello and welcome to the Northwood University monthly alumni webinar series. My name is Julia Damchak and I'm excited to be back with you today and host this webinar with our very special guest, Dr. Timothy Nash. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Nash for 25 plus years, and many of you will know him as your former professor, former campus leader, and of course, our economic scholar on campus. Today, Dr. Nash leads the McNair Center for Advancement of Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship on the Northwood University campus, and currently focuses on sharing his economic expertise and opinions with news publications all over the country. Before we get into his presentation, I just want to remind all of our guests today that we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please be sure to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we're also recording the webinar, so we'll send this out to you afterwards so you can go back and reference it or share it with any other alumni or friends that you might want to share it with. Today our topic is Reagan, Clinton, and the 2024 elections. And without any further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Timothy Nash.
Thanks, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to be with you. Some of you, as Julie noted, probably had in the classroom. It's always good to be back in front of a group of Northwood students. And I'll simply get started by saying, as Julie noted, at the McNair Center, we produce a lot of different articles and studies. Recently, if you're from Ohio, we did an economic competitiveness study for the state of Ohio. And on a regular basis this year, people have been asking us, what do we think about the 24 elections and what will be the key topics? And so this presentation comes from articles that we've had published in Town Hall. If you watch Fox News, Town Hall is a prevalent source of data for Fox News. Katie Pavlich is on Fox News quite a bit. She's the editor of Town Hall. So we had a recent piece in Town Hall, the Midland Daily News, and then the Detroit News. We were the front of Section C last week on taxation in the Detroit News. So with that in mind, we mentioned a number of items that we think are going to have an impact on the U.S. economy and therefore U.S. elections this fall. The one that I really didn't spend any time on in this presentation is inflation. And I'm just going to refer to inflation very briefly. You know, inflation is the real difficult one. For example, if you're President Biden, because when you look at inflation right now, from the time the president was elected or took office in January of 2021 to date, inflation's up almost 20% across the board. Some items like food, it's above 30%, and energy's above 30%, food's above 20%. Interest rates are dramatically higher, and former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, Larry Summers, actually said if you use the old inflation model that we had in the 1980s, that inflation, instead of hitting 9% in the middle of 2022, it would have been actually 17%. So inflation is a real problem, and that's an obvious problem. So if you look at our first slide, it is about economic growth, and this is where again we have problems if we're the Biden administration, and even the Trump administration didn't do that much better. But from the end of World War II until the beginning of the this particular time frame of the early late 2019, 2020, the U.S. GDP averaged 3.2% growth. In 2020, due to the COVID recession, the US economy contracted 3.5%, one of the worst one-year periods in the history of the post-World War II economy, certainly one of the worst periods since the Great Depression. However, even if you looked at the year 2020, the first half we had GDP contracting by over 30%. And then in the second half of 2020, the economy grew more than 30%. So it was a really tale of two halves of the year in 2020, as we went into a deep recession and came out of it in the same year. 2021, President Biden's first year, the economy grew at 5.9%. The next year, 2022, it grew at 1.9%. Last year, it came in at 2.5%. Right now, the first quarter of 2024 looks like it's going to grow at about 2.1%. So the economy is slowing under President Biden. Clearly not a good sign. If you look at jobs, yes, there have been a lot of jobs created under President Biden, but in most cases, economists would say it's been a lackluster job creation for the president, because about 10 million of the almost 14 million jobs created have been jobs restored versus jobs created. We restored a lot of the jobs we lost in 2020. And just so you know, we lost over 25 million jobs in the year 2020 during the COVID recession. All right. And so then after the next slide, as you take a look at it, our national debt. This is something, gang, that really troubles me and all of us at the McNair Center, all of us at Northwood, and that's our national debt. If you look at the national debt of the United States, it has grown dramatically during the period of the since President Reagan was elected president of the United States. Our debt to GDP was about 31%. It was just under $1 trillion. So from 1776 to 1981, the national debt of the United States grew from zero to almost $1 trillion. So it took us 205 years to really run up $1 trillion national debt. And it was 31.1% of GDP at the end of the fiscal year 1981. At the end of the fiscal year this past October, it was up to 31.17 trillion, and it grown to 114% of GDP. If you look at the growth in the national debt, our economy has grown at about 7.5 times from 1981 to the end of last year. Our national debt has grown 30.32 times, or it's grown 4 times faster, our government spending. And when you think about that, it's very problematic, because low estimates are that our national debt's going to be 50 trillion by the end of 2034. It could be as high as 144 trillion by 2054, with a per capita share of the national debt of over $1 million per household. Right now, the national debt is at 34.52 trillion, and it's 123.5% of US GDP. And a big chunk of that debt has come since 2010, when President Obama was president. Early in his presidency in 2010, the US national debt was 13.5 trillion. So we've gone from 13.5 trillion, and in less than 15 years, we've added $21 trillion to our national debt. It's a problem. And then if we look on the next slide at the national debt and we think about it on a global basis, the whole world has a major debt problem. It's not just the United States. And so if you look at the International Institute for Finance in London, England, they're saying that the national debt is $313 trillion and that it's roughly 330% of global GDP. Our calculations differ a little bit. We say it's about 298% of GDP, but that's a problem. And countries like China's at almost 300% of GDP. Japan is at 258% of GDP. You have a number of other countries that are finding it very hard to finance their economies and to grow their economies with their substantially high debt. And a number of other countries are going to find it hard to finance their own debt and buy U.S. debt. If you look at the next slide, what you see is that when you're looking at the U.S. debt, and if you look at the side slide there on the far right, you'll see that of our national debt of 34.52 trillion, a fairly substantial amount, roughly 7 trillion is owned by individuals outside of the U.S. or intergovernmental holdings in the U.S. So, as an example, Japan owns over $1 trillion worth of U.S. GDP. China used to own over $1 trillion, and because of their growing debt, they are actually reducing their share of U.S. national debt. And so as the debt goes higher, right now we depend on foreigners to help us finance that debt. And maybe to give you an interesting perspective, as of when I put these slides together over the weekend, our debt per person, if we said every American is going to pay their fair share of the debt, whether you were born yesterday or you're getting ready to die tomorrow, every American's share of the national debt per person is $102,500 or $626. And if it's more accurately per taxpayer, it's almost $270,000 per taxpayer, as you can see on the slide. So our ability to pay off our national debt, it's troubling, and it's going to remain troubling as we progress. Next slide is an analysis when you're looking at it as from the point of view of a consumer. And first of all, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at the consumer, the average American consumer is dealing with, as I noted in the beginning, inflation. And as you look at and you think about the cost of inflation, the real problem is looking at 2021 and analyzing where you are today. If you look at your wages and the growth in your wages or your pay increases relative to the cost of inflation, the average American needs somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 more than they're making today to have the same purchasing power they had in 2021 when President Biden took office. Now, on top of that, if you look at this study, the data that you're looking at right now comes from a quarterly report by the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So if you're interested in tracking household debt for your business or for regular activities, this report comes out quarterly from the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And what you see is that overall U.S. household debt is at a record high of $17.5 trillion. You can see over 12 trillion of that is in home mortgages. If you look at, there's over 1.6 trillion in automobile loan debt. If you look at credit card debt, is approaching 1.15 trillion. Student loan debt is now over $1 trillion. And right now, the consumer is dealing with a lot of problems that we are facing on top of having less purchasing power due to inflation. We've kept the economy going through consumer activity. And I think what's really important to try to understand is that when you look at the US economy, about 67% of our economy is driven by consumer activity. And if the consumer has less real purchasing power, less ability to buy things by $2,000 to $4,000 after you take inflation into consideration, and then on top of it, the consumer is making things work because they're going into debt at a higher level. And then on top of that, interest rates are a lot higher today than they were when the president took office in 2021. Home mortgage interest rates have doubled. Auto financing loans are up 2-3 times what they were when the president took office. What you see is that in January, there's been a decline of almost 1% in consumer activity. Consumer activity grew by 0.4% in December, which was slow, but it was still growth, even though December is one of the best years because of Christmas. So you see a slowing economy. But what you have is a much more highly indebted consumer, which with less purchasing power. And perhaps the most alarming point is that when you think about it, most of us would say, I would never not pay the IRS. I don't want the IRS on my back, but there's a record $700 billion in back taxes owed the IRS by Americans in general. That's the highest level I've seen of that figure in my lifetime. And it should be higher because the dollar's worth less, and we have we have a larger population. But again, it's a dramatically higher than, say, it was 10 years ago. So that's the quick snapshot at the consumer who drives our economy is looking weaker going into 2024, which we're coming to the end of the first quarter of 2024, we all know. All right, and then if you look at the next slide, you can see that on top of what we're trying to do with the economy, I just find it to be quite difficult to understand what's happening with U.S. energy policy. Here we have the largest economy in the world at about $27 trillion. We're the second largest manufacturing economy to China in the world. We're the high-tech leader. We're the home of all these great, we call them the Magnificent Seven companies from Apple and Microsoft to India and Google, and we are a leader in this particular space. We're also the home of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. We're the ones that create the most companies and the cutting edge technology. By large margins, America is the home of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. And in the last 20 years, one of the great breakthroughs for the American economy is we've become the world's leader in the production of oil and natural gas. And, if you're from, say, for example, the state of Ohio, Ohio has had a revolution in oil, but especially natural gas production. And so Ohio, has been one of the states where we've developed, the whole hydraulic fracturing revolution. Ohio went from producing about 50% of its electricity in 2000 from coal and about 3% from natural gas. Today, Ohio produces over 45% of its electricity from natural gas, and natural gas, being a very clean burning fuel, has dramatically reduced not only the carbon footprint of the state of Ohio, as an example, but has reduced the U.S. carbon footprint. So not only are we the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, we're among the world's most efficient, meaning we produce it at a low cost, and we produce among the cleanest, if not the cleanest, oil, natural gas, and coal in the world. And yet our current administration is trying to bring an end to fossil fuels in the United States and is encouraging us to be purchasing oil and natural gas from many Middle Eastern countries that are not friendly to the United States, Russia, and Venezuela. So, this is an area that we at the McNair Center have some problems with. If you also make a note, you'll see that one of the things that I didn't realize until we started working on an energy paper that we're releasing today, by the way, through Fox News, we're putting together a scorecard rating all 8 sources of energy in the United States, from oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, and hydroelectric. We rank all by giving each a grade. What you find out is that when you're focusing on, what I would describe as the big 2, oil and natural gas, most Americans aren't aware of the fact that we have 6,000 products that are produced by oil and natural gas, not to mention that 69% of all the homes and businesses in the U.S. are either illuminated, heated, or cooled with either oil or natural gas being the main source of the energy. And the thing that's important to understand is that fertilizer, most fertilizers, you use either oil or natural gas to produce fertilizer for farming. Over 60% of pharmaceuticals have some kind of a petroleum or natural gas basis. If you look at plastics, if you look at everything from a heart catheter to some kind of a machine, oftentimes if you look at hearing aids, or if you look at pacemakers for your heart, these are all contain materials that have either a petroleum or a natural gas component to them because they're safe inside the body, etc. So, U.S. energy policy has cost literally tens of thousands of jobs, high-paying jobs in the U.S. in the last 4 years. And right now we're having a big debate over whether or not we should be producing and sending liquefied natural gas to our allies like South Korea, Japan, and much of Europe. Okay, next slide. A lot of debate going on right now with regard to the border, and I think that I wish that the Republicans and Democrats would get together and play well together in the sandbox. I think this is a serious issue that we need to solve, and solve sooner than later, obviously. But I also think that President Biden and his team have a lot to account for on this particular issue, because if you look at the hard, cold facts, there's a dramatically higher level of people that are illegally crossing the border coming into the United States since the president was elected. It will be well over 10 million by the time the fall election takes place. And, the president and Secretary Mayorkas have said numerous times that the border is secure in the last almost 3.5 years. And the border is nothing other than it's not secure. And if you look at it, it's just a difficult policy. And it is not only something that is creating problems with regard to just the sheer financial burden that this is costing us when we have a $34.5 trillion national debt. We can't afford it. and it's bringing into play the security and safety of the United States, both internally and potential threats from abroad. And this is something that, if it is not straightened out, will be maybe the key issue when it comes to the fall of 2024 elections. And then our final slide is a slide on tax policy. And if you look at our tax policy, this is something that I think that President Biden is going to have a lot that he has to be accountable for, simply because when we say that rich people don't pay taxes, we've looked at a whole slew of sources, from the Tax Foundation to the National Taxpayers Union Foundation, to the Washington Post, and a number of other sources in between. And the fact of the matter is, when the president says rich people don't pay taxes, it's just not true. Even the statement that he's made that the billionaires in the United States, which there are, as he correctly points out, over 1,000 billionaires in the US, which I happen to think is a really good thing. I hope someday to be a billionaire. At age 66, my time line is getting shorter, but I'm still hoping. And when you look at a billionaire's usually added great success, jobs, and stability to the U.S. economy. And he claims that the billionaires average 8%. Well, the latest data that the Washington Post could find on the subject says no, billionaires pay about 24% of their income in taxes. So number one, that is just not true. And then number two, if you look at these particular slides, what you see is that when you're analyzing the fact that the average 1% of the population, the top 1%, in 1980, with a top tax rate of 70%, they were paying 19.3% of their income in taxes. So, a lot more than the 1% that they earned, or their share of the population. They were still paying a rather large share. But as we cut taxes, and you have to give President Trump credit for cutting taxes in 2017. If you look at the last available data, which is 2021, the top 1% earned a little over 25% of the income, and they paid almost 46% of the income taxes, which is quite a successful level of paying their quote unquote fair share. And so as we go through and we look at it, what you really find out, and what's especially maybe shocking, is that of the bottom 50% of income earners, they pay less than 3% of income taxes. And actually, about 37% of the bottom 50%, actually, as Milton Friedman pointed out, they get a negative income tax. So they actually get money back. Not only do they not pay income taxes, but they actually get subsidies of over $140 billion. And so we need to, speak openly and honestly about what the overall cost happens to be of these taxes, and the fact that, in my opinion, and the opinion of the McNair Center, we don't have a tax problem. We have a spending problem. We used to spend about 20% of U.S. GDP at the federal level. During COVID, we spent over 32%, and we're down to now about 25%. So why couldn't we go back to the average? Government is just, when a government creates a program, it becomes a problem because government has a real hard time cutting back once it's spending something. And so this is the final point, that we don't think that President Biden's policies that he's announced over the last couple of days of raising taxes make sense at all. And actually, the reason why you're starting to see a whole wide range of people across all, both genders, across all economic and ethnic categories, beginning to move toward former President Trump, is that they're realizing that if taxes go up, they know that they had a tax reduction when President Trump was president. So those are the categories that you see here, and I'll take any questions that you have regarding the presentation.
Thanks, Tim. We do have some questions coming in already.
Okay.
So we'll just hop right into them. What effect did the previous administration's tax cuts for the wealthy have on national debt?
Oh, I don't think that when you're looking at where we are with the current national debt, the biggest problems with the national debt have been, in my humble opinion, all of the excess spending due to COVID. I think President Trump spent way too much money on quote unquote COVID relief. We didn't need to spend it. We did. And, people can say, Nash, hindsight's always 2020. But I do believe we overspent on COVID, and I believe that President Biden has continued to do so. I don't think that, again, that tax cuts have done anything other than produce more revenue. Revenue increased after President Trump's tax cuts. It's just that government spending went up at a faster pace than the increased revenue. You can go back and look at Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the last 6 years of Reagan's economy, the last 6 years he was president, the economy boomed. And people say, well, the deficit went up under Reagan. Well, yeah, not because tax cuts didn't work. Revenue increased dramatically under President Reagan after his tax cuts that were implemented after his second year in office. The problem is government spending went up at a much faster pace than tax revenue.
Thank you. Next question. Anything in the pipeline for more nuclear power?
I sure hope so. I think that nuclear power it's much safer than it's ever been. A lot of people go back and think about the China syndrome, which was a popular movie when I was in high school and college. The problem with the movie, the China syndrome, that was a breeder reactor. We've never built breeder reactors in the U.S. other than for military purposes to produce the kind of uranium for nuclear weapons. And so the China syndrome never could have happened in the United States. The problem with 3 Mile Island, when you look back on it, it was a huge success. We didn't have the problems that we thought we might have had. The problems in Russia, in Kiev, with the nuclear explosion at the nuclear power plant was a breeder reactor without a containment dome. So I think that history and learning from history has shown us that nuclear power can be safe. The French have done a great job in showing that, and I sure hope that we have more nuclear power to complement clean oil and clean natural gas.
All right. Nancy is asking, do you factor global warming in at all when considering energy policy? Don't we want a safer world for our grandchildren?
I think the answer is absolutely yes, but I think that, again, what I would simply say is, number one, if you go through and you look at what natural gas has meant, natural gas has dramatically reduced the carbon footprint. The U.S. in the last 20 years, and don't depend on me, do your own research, but natural gas has dramatically reduced the carbon footprint for the U.S. The U.S. has been the world's leader in reducing the carbon footprint in the last 20 years. And I think that market solutions will help us reduce the global footprint while having a safe supply of energy and a safe supply of energy for the economy, for our defense, and quite frankly, for our human comforts. If you look at where we are today, the United States is not the problem, and the United States is painting and pointing toward the solution. Right now, what President Biden is doing, in my opinion, is he's taking American energy off the market and forcing people to buy, especially third world countries, much less clean coal from Europe and the old Soviet Union, and definitely less clean oil and natural gas from Russia, from the Middle East, from Venezuela. And that's just a fact. And that doesn't take into consideration that when we're not dealing with the fact that we're looking at all of the environmental damage that comes from mining the rare earth minerals, because most of those are being mined outside of the United States, because we have regulations curtailing the exploration and drilling for rare earth minerals, which when we do it in the United States, we do it in the cleanest, safest way possible. So I think that across all cases, we are damaging the environment, and we're not doing the kinds of things to improve the environment. And I would suggest, one of the top environmental scientists who definitely believes we need to be doing things the right way is a guy by the name of Bjorn Lomborg. He's from Denmark. He invented something called the Copenhagen Consensus. And he's also an adjunct scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's one of the top climate scientists in the world. And he would agree with everything that I'm saying, that it is a problem, but the United States is not the problem. It's really presenting a lot of the solutions to global warming.
All right. We're going to try to wrap this up in about 3 more minutes. So we'll try to get to these last questions if we can. Do you favor returning to the tax rates of the Reagan administration?
I would simply say that some kind of a combination of the Reagan and the Trump administration tax cuts are very favorable. But again, what we need to do is we need to cut government spending. We need to get government spending under control, which we simply do not have under control at this point. I would also say that if we all go back to our principles of economics days, I remember my time with Orville Watts and Larry Reed in different econ classes at Northwood, and there was a guy by the name of Steve Forbes who is still alive today. He was running the empire his father started, Forbes magazine, and Forbes was the champion of a flat rate tax. Boy, I'll tell you what, I would love to see the United States adopt a flat rate tax. No exemptions, no deductions. We'd find out if I was a good Catholic, would I continue to make donations to the Catholic Church? Would I continue to write checks to Northwood University and other wonderful causes that we should all be supporting? Because we'd take away all the tax write-offs, but we'd say you got a 10% flat rate tax. And you'd get a postcard in the mail, or in an envelope, and it would say you earned this amount of money, and now you need to pay 10%. And most of us would have already paid it. And you know what it would do? It would dramatically reduce the need for the complexity of the tax system we have. Think of all the people that would not be employed. Think of all the accountants that could be employed making businesses more effective, because we wouldn't need them to fill out our tax returns. So, yeah, I think that I would go one step further and say I'm a big believer in a flat rate tax. And a number of states have flat rate taxes, and they work just fine.
All right, last question. If government reduces spending, does that have a negative effect on our economy?
Well, in some areas it would, absolutely. But I think that the real problem today is that there is a number of things that we rely on the government to do. And ladies and gentlemen, I would simply say we are the government, and we need to make certain that we're a lot more involved with our government than we have been. Winston Churchill said at the end of World War II, the price that people pay to be free is eternal vigilance. And I would simply say that we can do things better. And a lot of the things we ask the government to do, we should be doing on our own. I'll give you one final example. When you give $1 to the government to help a poor person, you have a lot of well-intended politicians that are trying to help poor people. But when you give $1 to the government, about 20 to 25 cents on the dollar gets to the poor person. About 75 to 80% of that money is eaten up in administrative cost. If you give it to your church, your synagogue, your mosque, about 90 cents gets to the poor person, sometimes even more than that. I'm a big believer in Tunnel to Towers. It's a charity that I'm sure we've all heard of, but they have an administrative cost rate of 5%. So if you give them $1, 95 cents gets to the cause of giving homes to people that have lost a loved one, a father or a mother, in a war or in police activity or a fire person's activity. They build homes for people that have lost a loved one, defending the different rights that we have either at home or abroad. And so that administrative costs being low, sometimes the private sector charities do a much better job than government, and that's a way we can make government more efficient. And yes, we would have some people lose their jobs with the government, but they'd find jobs elsewhere. This economy is a very vibrant economy that would only be more vibrant if we were cutting taxes and reducing the size and scope of government. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor to be with you. If I can help you in any way, you know how to get a hold of me at Northwood. And Julie, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nash. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today. Remember to check your inbox. We will send you the recording. We're also going to send you a survey to share your thoughts. And don't forget, tomorrow is Northwood University Day of Giving, which is also, we're celebrating our Founders Day. So I encourage you to participate, give back to your alma mater, make sure we're producing more Northwood graduates. And have a wonderful day, and we'll see you online next month. And hey, Tim, you've got a lot of comments here, so I'm going to send all the comments over to you. We've got Bob and Shelly and George and Ken and Don Gottwald. They're all saying great job today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.